Hi, I'm Dave Coach, and I am here today to try and help you find the correct settings when shooting real estate photography. Notice I didn't say the right settings because there are right settings for a variety of different situations. So no one answer fills every need. But there are things that you need to know and things you need to think about when setting your settings. Not so sure about that. There are certain things you need to keep in mind when setting your camera so that you can get the picture that you want. Not only will using the proper settings save you time, hassle, and a lot of headache on location, but once you have the proper settings locked down and something that you can use, you'll probably save a lot of time in post-processing too. Like I said, there's no right settings. There are settings that are right for you and right for different situations. So we're not going to go through, and I'm not going to tell you 1/125th of a second at f8. I'm going to tell you what I use and why and when I use that. And hopefully from that, you'll be able to develop settings that work well for you. First, let's talk about the camera itself. As you can see, I use Nikon, and for those of you familiar with Nikon, you probably know this is a Z6. That is a mirrorless camera. This is what I prefer. This is not what you need. Any camera will work. Anything from a micro four thirds all the way up to a medium format. Yes, I do know people who have shot medium format, not really real estate, and honestly, they were doing it for fun. In fact, I think Jordan just shot a house on film with a Hasselblad. So, it takes all kinds. But let's start with the basics. You're probably going to have a 35mm camera. The difference between the crop sensor and the full frame is negligible. It really honestly doesn't matter. For what we're shooting, it's going to end up at 1500, 1800, 2000 pixels wide on the MLS, and all of those cameras have megapixel ranges above that. So don't even think about whether you need micro four thirds, crop sensor, or full sensor. It really doesn't matter as far as the resolution of what you're shooting for real estate. I just happen to shoot full frame because that's what all my gear is. But if you're shooting crop sensor, there's nothing wrong with that. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that the angles are a little different. When I say that I'm shooting a 14-30 here, with crop sensor, that's probably about a 10-24. So you need to know that there's a little bit of difference there. The other thing you need to know is you get, I think with crop sensor, you get a little bit more depth of field for any given f-stop. If that's making your head hurt, just wait a minute, we'll get to that. But for all intents and purposes, it does not matter. The best camera in the world for any job is the one that you have. Anyway, now let's go on to the brand. Nikon, Canon, Sony. It's kind of like Ford, Chevy, Lamborghini. Well, maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, again, it really doesn't matter. Whatever your preference is, whatever you're used to is, again, the best camera. Knowing that when you go to the menu and you know where all those settings are is the most important thing. So don't switch from Sony to Nikon because you heard Nikon's got better color geometry or something like that, because then you'll be lost when you go to the menu, and that just doesn't help you at all. As I mentioned, this camera's a mirrorless. For real estate photography, again, it doesn't really matter a whole lot because we're pretty much going to be using the back screen for focus and adjustments and all that. So doesn't really matter. I prefer mirrorless. I think kind of it's the future. I'm getting old. I have to wear glasses now. So it does help me that I have an electronic viewfinder, especially for focus for something like Milky Way photography or something like that. But for real estate, it again doesn't matter. Mirrorless has a couple advantages. Optical has a couple advantages. I happen to come down on the mirrorless side. For you, again, the camera you have is the best camera for the job. Now let's talk a little bit about lenses. As you can see, this is a 14-30, and I think that's a really good range for basic real estate photography. If you're a beginner, you're probably going to be shooting down in this range. As you get more experience, you'll start to creep up into the 20, 24 range. And that's because, well, a variety of reasons. You know, I think a lot of times beginners are afraid of missing something, so they shoot as wide as they possibly can, and that way they get everything. I tend to think that it adds a lot of distortion and unnaturalness to the look. I prefer to back up and zoom in and shoot that way. But, you know, again, that's where you're at and what you're comfortable shooting. But something in the 14 to 30 range in a zoom is going to work really, really well for you. For crop sensor, that would be, again, I think it's about a 10 to 24. You'll also notice this is an f4 lens. We'll be shooting generally in the f8 to f11 range. So having a faster lens, although you pay a lot more for that, it's not going to benefit you at all for shooting. So don't even think about spending the extra money for an f2.8 lens. You don't need to. Get the f4 and you'll be just fine. All right, we're about to get to the meat of this, I promise. But just one more thing, I just want to touch on the exposure triangle. I know, especially for beginners, that freaks a lot of people out. Don't let it freak you out. Just know that there are three things that affect how much light is hitting the sensor in a camera. And those are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And when one goes up, another one has to go down or up or whatever to adjust to get the proper exposure. So if you decide that you're going to, that you want super depth of field, so you're going to stop down to f22, less light is coming in, so you're going to have to give up at another corner of the exposure triangle to get that light made back up that you lose when you stop down. That's really it. If you use the exposure meter on your camera, and it's right there, let's see, let's get it out there. Right there, you can see that's way underexposed. Let's take off the lens cap maybe. See, as long as you know where that exposure needs to be, it doesn't matter what the f-stop, the ISO is, you can adjust for that exposure. So let's take this and let's go to f22. Notice it gets darker, just like I said. So we adjust something else to get the exposure back to where we want. That's all the exposure triangle means, is if you change one, you have to change something else to make up for it. So finally, we're to the meat of all this. What are the proper settings for real estate photography? And again, I'll tell you, there's no such thing as a proper setting. But there are some basic guidelines for and again, this is a generality. And I'll tell you where I start off. First off, Nikon does this. I don't know what camera you're using. Hopefully you've got presets too. But one thing I do, and I'll show you right here, right now, I'm going to turn this off. We have these user presets, and I have U1 set to where I start my exposure process from. So I'm just going to go into U2 just to throw it out of bounds. And you can see we're at ISO 100 f8 at 1/6 of a second. That is not where I start at all. So I'm going to pop it over to U1, which is preset for where I start real estate photography from. And you'll see I started at 1/15 of a second, f8 at ISO 320. And that, to me, is a good middle starting point. From here, all I do is I do a couple quick swipes this way, and I'm at the exposure level where I want to be for an interior. If I go the other way, a couple quick swipes, and I'm at 1/400th of a second, and that's outside exposures. So all I have to do is turn this one dial, set my shutter speed, and adjust for that level to get the exposure that I want. Okay, why do I choose f8? f8 is about the middle of most aperture ranges in a lens. This lens goes from f4 to f22. So f8's about in the middle. That tends to be the sweet spot for the sharpest place, the sharpest focus that lens has. You can, I think it's DxO, has all the lens reports. You can look up the lens that you use and find out where the sharpest f-stop is. I'm not that anal about it. I just say f8 and go with it. But f8 gives you a really good depth of field. It will not focus this close to the camera if you're focused way out there. But if you're focused 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet into a scene, you're going to get a depth of field that covers just about any shot, or it'll be close enough that nobody's going to tell on the MLS. So f8 is a good place to start. If you're looking at something and you want to make sure you've got really good depth of field, you've got a fantastic view out the window, you might want to turn that down to f10, f11. So you say to yourself, well, Dave, why don't you always shoot at f11 then if that's more depth of field? Well, it does start to roll off the focus a little bit. It does start to soften a little bit. The other thing is f8 to f11 is one stop of light. And when you're shooting with flash, you have to bring the flashes up one more stop to get the same amount of light and exposure in a room. For those of you who don't know, your f-stop, your aperture, is the only thing that affects how much light a flash is putting onto your sensor. So when you change the f-stop, you're changing the amount of light that a flash will give. You can change your shutter speed all you want, and your flash will be exactly the same, no matter, well, when you get into hundreds of thousands of seconds, maybe it might make a difference. But for all intents and purposes, your shutter speed has no effect on flash, but your f-stop does. So you want to bring it down, at least I do, because I use flash, to about f8, so I'm not pushing my flashes too hard. So there's kind of the considerations I use when setting my f-stop. Again, like I said, I generally shoot at f8, and unless there's something extraordinary happening, I leave it there and I will adjust my other two parameters. My second parameter is the ISO, and you can see I've set that at 320. Again, I just kind of think that that's a fine middle ground. I don't think we're getting enough noise at 320 for it to even matter compared to, I think the natural ISO for this camera is 100. So I'm getting an extra stop there by going to 320, and I'm really not suffering. When I go into basements tend to have lower light levels than ground floors or upper floors, and I will boost that up to, sometimes even 1250, 1600 if it's really dark. Only for the basement. I don't want that much noise in my regular pictures. But if I've got a dark room or it's a dark day, ISO 800 isn't going to make that much of a difference. So I go ahead and I will play with that on dim days or in dark rooms. Another reason I might play with the ISO is, again, when I go into a dark room or something like that, it will lengthen the shutter speed. Take, for instance, an average house. An average house at f8 and at 320 with normal windows and all that, I will shoot indoors at maybe one half a second to 1 second. Generally in there. Sometimes really bright houses, maybe up to a 15th of a second, and really darker, gloomier houses, maybe down to 2 seconds. But when you go into a basement, all of a sudden you've got a lot less light, and that maximum 2-second exposure is now 10 seconds. If you're shooting HDR or you're shooting brackets, that brighter exposure is now going to be 30 seconds. And that's sometimes, call me impatient, but that's too long to wait. So that's another reason I would boost the ISO so that I can get that regular exposure back to a second, a half a second, a third of a second. So I'm not waiting forever for exposures. Again, I would only adjust the ISO when you go into a dark room, and I would take it back out when I came into a brightly lit room. So the third corner of our exposure triangle is the shutter speed. And for all practical purposes, when I'm on location, that's the only thing I change. I'll leave it at f8, I'll leave it at ISO 320, and I'll just use my shutter speed to get an exposure. And just to let you know, and this is what works for me, this may not work for you. Let's take a look at an exposure here. Let's go back to f8. That's about where I consider a normal exposure, just slightly above 0, and that's where I'll expose at. And when I do a 3 exposure bracket, that'll give me 1/3 of a second, which is right in the range I told you an interior would be. And then our fast exposure, 1/13 of a second, and our long exposure, 1.3 seconds. So that's all fairly fast, and that works really good. When we go outdoors, like I said, let me get that back out again. You know, I'll be dropping this into the 250 to 600 range, but I won't change anything else. And that works out just fine. It's just really when you get into this, 3 to 5 second range in a dark room that you run into trouble. So those are basically where I keep my settings and why. And I think if you keep these lessons in mind and these thoughts in mind, you'll be fine finding the exposures that work for you. A couple of other settings on the camera that we haven't touched on, white balance. I generally don't really touch white balance. I think it's much easier to take care of in Lightroom when I've got a big screen and I can look at it with critical detail. But I just leave it on auto and let the camera figure it out. If it's right, great, less work for me. If it's wrong, like I said, I'll fix it in Lightroom, and our next step will be why Lightroom is a fine place to fix it and why it doesn't make a difference. Final thing you need to have set in your camera, and this is a must, you have to shoot RAW. Right there, image quality RAW. Always RAW. The reason, and this is really hard to wrap your head around, and to be honest, I sometimes it makes my head bleed and my brain come out my ears, but the difference between RAW and JPEG is RAW is the actual sensor data. It's not an image. It is the data directly off of the sensor. It's, sensor, whatever, over 14 and down 12, 255. This one is 297. It's whatever those numbers are. It's all that raw data. So what that means is, it doesn't mean you're getting an unprocessed image. It means you're getting the raw data that the image is created from. The image is not even there yet. And that's kind of the hard thing, I think, to grasp. It is everything that the image is made from, but it's not the image. A JPEG takes that raw information and says, we're going to make this white, we're going to make this black, and it makes all those adjustments and is an image. RAW is not an image. RAW will give you the most latitude in making adjustments to make that image good again, or good. Whereas a JPEG, you're stuck with this image and you've got very little latitude to make changes with the different components, contrast, light, color, that sort of thing. I know you see them both as images, and that's why it's hard to grasp. But just know that the same adjustment you make in your camera to adjust white balance is the same exact adjustment Lightroom is doing when you adjust the color temperature there. They're both taking that raw data and saying, okay, this is where white is, and making that adjustment. So there's no loss of quality, and that's why we always shoot in RAW. You've got so much more latitude, you can make so many more changes, and there's so much more you can do. JPEG locks you into what the manufacturer of this camera thinks is a good image in these circumstances. It's pre-wired in. Raw, you get to make the decisions. All right, this is really about camera settings and all that, but there are a couple more things that we should go over. One, you need as good a camera support as possible. Buy a good tripod, something that doesn't wiggle. If you're shooting multiple exposures, HDR, bracketing, flash, ambient, anything like that, you can't afford to have the camera move at all between shots. Also, speaking to camera movement, one of the things that will help you is to do, rather than single frame where you push the button and you shoot the picture. See how that causes my camera to jiggle? Let's go back into the modes. I choose a 2-second delay. Shoot with a self timer. That way, when you hit the button, 1, 2, it shoots 2 seconds later. And that way, any of the jiggle you get from pressing the button is taken out of the camera and you get another clean, crisp image. Another thing to consider is even if your tripod is steady, when you press the button, if you're shooting the picture right away and you press the button and you put any jiggle into it and you're shooting it a half second, a second, 2 seconds, that will cause blur. At least that's what it will look like to you, because you're getting just a little bit of movement that's going to cause a little bit of blur, even though you're tack sharp in focus. So if you're getting a lot of out of focus or images that look out of focus, I'll bet 9 times out of 10, it's because you're not putting a delay on the camera to take the picture, and you yourself are introducing that with a little bit of movement. So put a delay on the camera to take the shot. The other thing, at least with Nikon, is when I go into a bracket mode and I do have it on a delay, I press the button and it will shoot the complete bracket sequence after that. Whereas if I'm in single exposure mode, I have to press the button for every single exposure. And yeah, I'm that lazy. Well, I do hope this helps. I hope this gives you a better understanding of exposure, how the different components affect exposure, and what we are looking for and need in real estate photography. I may not be 100% right on all of these. You may have different reasons for wanting to do something different, and that's fine. Just know what you're doing, know why you're doing it, and do what works for you. This is what works for me. I'm super happy with it. I get a lot of great pictures doing it this way. If you have other thoughts, put them in the comments below and let's discuss it. Thanks so much for being here. Make sure to like and subscribe, and may your next image be your best image.